This button goes forward and backward. Rotation.
Forward? This one?
Yes.
Okay. Have to cover the tech stuff right at the last minute. This is the way we do our show, too. That's why we always start 5 minutes late. Okay.
Things here, if you walk around, you have to point toward the wall.
I have to point to the wall?
Only if you walk over here.
Only if I walk over there. I won't walk over there then. All right. When they asked me to come speak here, they asked me to speak about the failures of creationism, and I think that they meant to say the falsehoods of creationism, but speaking about the failures of creationism gave me an idea. Now, I would like to talk about the failures of creationists, but for a couple of reasons I won't. One, the list is too voluminous. And two, we're not going to be bashing on religion today. And three, an important message probably. As I was listening to Teresa McBain and Jerry talking about how they were when they believed, had I encountered them in a public place, there likely would have been an argument. There likely would have been a debate between us. And it's important to remember that the most outspoken advocates we have were once believers. And so they don't now, as they didn't then, deserve, what is the word I'm looking for? Hostility, we'll call it. Just bear in mind, they've just been deceived, perhaps. And maybe they've never questioned. But a little patience, a little tolerance. Let's see if this thing works. Oh, good. Okay, so we can begin. The primary failure of creationism is it is a controlled belief. Now, I'm going to focus on creationism as opposed to religion, just as a subset of that. And creationism is a form of religious extremism, one which requires a denial of science, specifically. It is a denial. It's not an argument of whether we're talking about any scientific application that links humans with other animals versus a specific interpretation of any particular religious doctrine. What it really is methodological naturalism, also known as the scientific method, pitted against supernaturalism, a belief in magic. And the first of the list of failures of creationism that I'm going to talk about also, coincidentally, is the first foundational falsehood of creationism. Let's see if this button works. There we go. This, from creationism.com, this is a campaign wherein they mean to target high school kids so that they will disrupt their science classes by asking inane questions that they hope or they think that their parents will or their teachers will not be able to answer. On their website, curiously, they show that everyone has already answered their questions, and then they have a series of excuses trying to dismiss those answers. What's important here, this statement, this is the denial of methodological naturalism, and it is the assumption that accepting scientific explanations requires somehow a rejection of belief in God. And this is what they try to do to polarize their own community. That if you accept the science at all, you've got to take it all, and you've got to reject religion entirely. So we lose a lot of secular-minded people in this polarization process. Now, I'd like to see a show of hands for all those in this room who were educated in evolution in public school. Okay. Keep your hands up if you're educated in evolution in public school and you know that statement to be false. Keep your hands up if you think that the person who made that claim knew it was false. I don't think a single hand moved. Thank you. This is the demonstration. My wife doesn't like me to bring up the dishonesty of creationism, but it is willfully dishonest. And this is a demonstration of that. Now let me see if I can get to the next line of this. Oh, wait, you know what? It'd be handy to have some notes here. There we go. Okay, now, this argument was generated quite a long time ago, about 2,600 years ago. You remember in Cosmos, Carl Sagan talked about the Ionian scientists and how some of these brilliant lads had devised that atoms existed and all that matters, all matter was made out of these. And one of them, Anaximander, I think it was, had even concluded that all life was related, and he postulated some form of evolution, though the details are sketchy and what we know of it is very sparse. Possibly he looked at the mutations of tadpoles into frogs or something like that, and then compared that to fish and salamanders, lizards and mice and so on. So, I'm ready for this next one. That happened in around 600 BC, and curiously, at about the same time, you had the early formations of Judaism and Buddhism and Taoism and Zoroastrianism, all at about the same time. And now the conversation between Lord Krishna and King Arjuna was supposed to have happened 5,000 years ago, if you believe the Hindus, but there's elements of the Bhagavad Gita that throw the context into the same period, so roughly 600 BC. The statement from Lord Krishna here could be addressing these Ionian scientists. The persons of the demonic nature say the entire cosmic manifestation is unreal, without a creator, without a supreme controller, without cause. And look at the explanation he's got. Originating from natural cohabitation due only to lust. No more than this. So, here we have somebody objecting to the natural methods in favor of divinity. It has to be all supernatural. It cannot be natural. And obviously there's some relation to evolution here. They seem to have a concept of it. Now, the second failure of creationism, if this works, where? Here we go. Yeah, I'm glad it goes backward. Okay, incredulity. Does this look like Ray Comfort? Okay. I know so many people that take this exact stance in any kind of religious debate or any kind of a science debate. The game is not to understand it. I don't understand it, and I need to protect my kids from understanding it. It's an interesting challenge I've made to many, many people, that if you'll allow me the time necessary to do it, because it involves an education, I will be happy to teach you evolution in such a way, very briefly as possible, that you will understand that it is a fact, and you will be an evolutionist. Regardless whether you continue to believe in a God or not, you will be an evolutionist from that point to the rest of your life. And so far, only one person has ever accepted that challenge. Every time I say, I can prove it, we go through these, a handful of exchanges, maybe a dozen or so. I ask you a series of questions, you provide your answers, you'll get to understand it, I'll explain these things, you will accept evolution. The only person to ever accept that challenge married me. Now, it's part of that is, if I don't understand it, it can't be true. That's part of incredulity. The other part of incredulity is, does this work? Okay. God of the gaps. Anything we cannot explain, therefore God did it. They assume that theirs is the default position, somehow. The thing that they are arguing for, that they provide no evidence for, is what we must assume there is. If we can't provide evidence to the contrary, it's a complete reversal of the burden of proof. And let's see, one of the problems with this, and there are several, is that, first of all, if we don't explain anything, if there's something that we don't explain in science, it doesn't mean that God did it. I don't understand it, therefore magic. If we look at examples through history, and I'm going to show a couple of these in a moment, there was a time when we thought that comets were omens. There were a time when what is apparently a volcanic eruption in the book of Exodus is described as being the power and might of God. We've seen many examples like this when epilepsy was once thought to be demonic possession. We didn't have an explanation for it. The fact that we didn't have an explanation for it, couldn't explain what epilepsy was at that time, did not mean that it was a god. And I'm going to show some other examples as we get on. Let's see. The other problem that they have with this is that theirs is not the default position. I'm hating this remote. Okay, so there's not just the one God. And there's not just the one religious perspective either. When I made my slow and arduous transition from the culture that I was raised in, which is, of course, Christianity, to the position I now don't hold, one of the many stages in that, I went through a sort of a neo-paganism, and I'm exploring and experimenting with different ideas, and I'm treating them all scientifically. I'm thinking that, or I was thinking for a long time, that there was some scientific evidence for supernatural things. I believed in some of the films that I saw of the people moving the magnets with their hands. I thought for a long time that Kirlian photography was real, and some of the stuff that you see in the pseudo-documentaries and such of what people can do, I thought there was some substance to that once upon a time. And I tried to come up with hypotheses for how life, physical life, could be interrelated with the supernatural element, and I came up with these. The one idea that I really embraced was, imagine that you have a clay sculpture, and you make the clay sculpture by adding water, and you mix the clay together and you form it, and it's only fluid when it's got the water in it, and so that represents life. And that when the water ebbs out of that, of course, it dries up and it cracks and it falls back away, and it goes, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And where does the water go? The water goes, evaporates back into the hydrosphere, which in my analogy is a biosphere. And so this is how I envisioned the supernatural element of life force. I thought that we would be brought back into the biosphere, into the oneness, how you become one with all things. It created a sort of an interesting thing about reincarnation, though, because if you die, imagine pouring a glass of you into the ocean and then trying to scoop it back up again, and of course you're not going to get all of you. You'll get some of you and some of lots of other little things too. So you could be reincarnated at one moment from mold, grass, spores, fungus, trees, crabs, flies, a number of other things, a couple of other people, and bits of yourself, but not whole you. So that was a perspective that I had once upon a time. That's just one of many. Lao Tzu created a wonderful analogy that now seems to parallel what string theorists are talking about, the origin of the universe as being a collision of great brains or cosmic membranes. Lao Tzu said in the Tao Te Ching that your universe was created by a collision of light and dark forces. So the Christian aspect of God is not necessarily the default, and I'm probably going to talk about a couple of others here as we move along.
Hey, Aaron.
What?
On the remote, you can use either the keyboard or point your remote at the bottom of the laptop.
The bottom of the laptop.
You can use the return key.
I love getting some tech support in front of a whole audience. Thank you. One of the great failures of creationism, and I'm going to point at the laptop to see if this works. One of the great failures of creationism is the power of prayer. Oh, good, it worked.
You prayed on it.
Yes, now, as a personal aside, and I will probably regret bringing this up, but when my own granddaughter was going through repeated trials of chemotherapy for leukemia, well-meaning coworkers came to me many times offering to pray for me. And at one point, I had just lost patience with it, and I said, look, with all due respect, and I love you, but you may as well write a letter to Santa. Because that's literally what that means to me. Imagine a child coming up and telling me that she's going to write a letter to Santa, and the Santa will make the leukemia go away. That is how much comfort your prayer does not bring. Because I've noticed somehow that the prayers never seem to take effect until the chemo starts flowing. Now, as we mentioned, once upon a time, when we didn't have scientific explanations for everything, we had, for example, we did not have the germ theory of disease. Now remember, germs are a theory. And I trust that the people in this room understand what that means. All diseases of Christians, and I wonder why it's only diseases of Christians and not other people, but all diseases of Christians are to be ascribed to these demons. Chiefly do they torment freshly baptized Christians. Okay, so getting baptized causes disease. Says something about the quality of their water, doesn't it? Yea, even the guiltless, newborn infants. This is St. Augustine. This was a pinnacle of wisdom in his day. Can you imagine how awful it must have been to live then? Now, if we move forward, I think roughly 1,000 years, we get this brilliant piece of work. This is the founder of Protestant Christianity. Idiots, the lame, the blind, the dumb are men in whom the devils have established themselves. All the physicians who heal these infirmities, as though they proceeded from natural causes, are ignorant blockheads. This is an example of Ken Ham of his century. And laughingly, the note down below there, this was somebody that used to post against me in Talk.Origins and Alt.Talk.Creationism, and he also posted against P.Z. Myers too. And he actually believed this kind of nonsense. He once tried to take me on in a moderated debate, which would have been my first debate, but he backed out of it, saying that to argue with me was to be like arguing with Satan, and so he backed up because he would not deal with the devil. So let's see. Now, another failure of creationism is this whole morality issue. Now, why is this a creationism issue and not a religious issue? It's not about whether you believe that the world was created. It's not about whether you believe in original sin. There are a lot of Christians that I've encountered and a lot of other religious people who believe that you have this judgment going against you depending on your acts, depending on how you behave, that that's the way it should be. And by rights, if there is a system of judgment at all, that is what it should be. But we are judged, according to the forms of religion that I'm most familiar with, we are judged not by whether we are good or bad. It does not matter how evil we are. We can be forgiven for any sin. All that matters is that we believe. We have to believe without reason. We have to have faith. There's many times in there it says that you have to have complete faith, that you must get rid of all doubt. And I was criticized for rendering faith this way, despite the fact that every former theologian I meet describes faith in much the same way. Jerry DeWitt, Dan Barker, and so on. They all give the same description, but when I give the same description that they do, well, then I'm misrepresenting the religion, and that it shouldn't be that way at all. And things just suddenly got really loud. There's probably some things we could talk about Pascal's wager in here too, because you want to talk about how God can be universal when he can't even somehow be global. Pascal decided that it was better to believe and therefore be saved, and playing that the safety card. But if you accept Jesus and you accept his wager, then what happens if it's not actually Jesus, it's the God, but it's actually Allah, or rather Yahweh, since they're both essentially the same thing. They're Jesus' daddy, which in Isaiah 45 says, there is nobody else but me, and no one sits beside me. And then later Jesus comes along and says, well, I sit beside God. And we have a small contradiction here. And then God says, no, I am both good and evil. I created everything, and there is none beside me. And Jesus says, nobody gets to God but me. And God says in the first commandment, thou shalt not worship any other gods before me. So then you have Jesus say, I'm before God and I'm the only way. So if you accept Jesus, you are pissing off the Father God. According to two different religions, so you're outnumbered here. And then, oddly enough, if you're atheist and you don't believe, well then absolutely nothing happens. You die just like you're supposed to. You just die completely, both in the body and the soul. You just die, just like everything should eventually. If you're Hindu, you might come back. I'm not talking zombies, but something else going on there. And until you get faith, and then you can be taken out of the cycle and then put in some other place. And the whole morality issue, again, falls apart when they want and I've seen Answers in Genesis do advertisements like this where they talk about the evils of evolutionism, and they call evolution a religion, and they accuse us of being doing such horrible, terrible things, and obviously they've never read their own storybook. And I read passages out of their storybook to them because for some reason a lot of Christians won't read the Bible. And when you read passages out of it, very often I've been told that it doesn't say that. And when I walk over with the passage, it doesn't say that. Okay. I've literally gotten that response. People won't look because they know it's there. Now, the next failure of creationism is where they accuse evolution of being religion. It is equivocation, a combination of equivocation and projection, taking all their faults and trying to put it onto you. It's, the old saying, the pot calling the kettle black. In this case, I think it's the pot calling the silverware black, because they keep putting onto us things we will not share. Evolution is a religion, of course. Science relies on faith, just like religion does. I got an article that was written about me today that tried to tell me that I was misrepresenting Christianity because science also relies on faith, and that science is required to believe that 2 + 2 = 4. Are you not required to believe it? No, you're required to prove it. Science is biased, just like religion is. Well, actually, no. Scientists, being human, understand that every human has biases. And we understand that the worst science is that which is biased. And that's why we have a peer review process, and that's why we have evidence-based postulations where you cannot say that anything is true. You can't even say that anything might be true until you have evidence showing that at least the circumstances are favorable. You certainly can't say that anything is true unless you can show that it evidently is true. It doesn't matter how hard you believe it. If you say, I believe X, and you don't have evidence behind it, you've destroyed your own reputation as a scientist. If you say further, not just that you believe X, but that X is so, then you would be a fraud in every context except religion, where somehow fraud equals revelation of absolute truth. There is no evidence for evolution, Big Bang, abiogenesis, etc., so you all believe it on faith. But there is evidence for creation, the flood, and God, etc. And religion is reasonable, just like science is. That was the article that was written about me today, trying to talk about how reasonable religion is, where you have to believe this, or you're going to be burned in hell, and you will receive unimaginable rewards if you just buy our nonsense without question. And neither the carrot nor the stick will actually have to be produced. We don't have to substantiate either one. Just believe me, because I said so. And religion can be confirmed empirically, just like science. This is where you get into the creation science empiricism, which I'm going to avoid today. I had a whole lot of extra stuff on that, but I don't want to keep it going too long. And of course, creationism is scientific. This one I'm going to attack just a little bit, if I can get the button to work. Okay. This I got from, I think it was from Answers in Genesis, but this is an example of the division that they try to come up with for microevolution versus macroevolution, because we do see evolution happening all the time, and they can't deny the evolution that we see all the time, so they have to deny the evolution that they won't see at any time. And what they don't see ever is anything ever being created. Now, we do have people arguing about quantum mechanics and matter popping in and out of existence, but we don't have complex systems and animals being poofed out of nothing. We don't have situations like Star Trek where you have somebody has psychic powers, and so they demonstrate them and measurable, and everybody can see that Spock is actually doing this, and we're finding out useful data from this, and this can't be faked. There's lots of things. If these things actually existed, we would be able to demonstrate it. We would be able to show it. But we don't. And so this guy is saying that we don't see evolution, but we do actually see evolution, and we have a good idea of how it works. We have many ideas about how it works. Now, this, of course, is microevolution. This is variation within species, and as creationists would argue that you don't see new species evolve, but of course we do. We've actually got examples of dozens of cases where we've had new species evolved under direct observation, both in the lab and in naturally controlled conditions in the field, and we get more all the time. One of the things that I think has been a huge revelation for me was when I got out of the popular press and started reading peer-reviewed work, because and there's more coming in all the time. When I did my video on the 8th foundational falsehoods of creationism, I wanted to talk about beneficial mutations, which is another thing that creationists say that we don't have. And I picked a handful that I had gotten from the news media. And I chose it from the news media because I wanted it to be readily accessible, something that would be easily looked up. When you try to look up scientific documents, sometimes the source that you're going to will only allow you to read the abstract if you can find it at all, or you need to do a login. Science is not doing themselves any favors by making the information difficult to get. It's already difficult to understand for most people. Don't make it hard to find. But concordance and other PhD specialists start bringing me news articles, or not news articles, but peer-reviewed work that they happen across when I ask specific questions on practically anything. They have brought me a number of articles on, and I should have included them here probably, but there were several that I gave in an earlier speech where a defect in our fundamental primate genes, genes that we share with all other primates, a defect in these handful of genes has resulted in our jaw diminishing in size and strength and being concordant with the enlargement of our brains. For example, so regulatory genes shared by all primates, turned off in us, deactivated, disabled, damaged, are largely what influenced what we are. So this was not an example of new information. Strangely, we are broken primates, and this is why we are so good. Go figure that out. Well, we don't have examples of beneficial mutations and natural selection. Yes, we do. We have many, many. And we understand more than just natural selection now. We also have a good idea on genetic drift and other aspects like sexual selection, which Victorian England wouldn't have granted. They wouldn't have imagined that the way that females choose mates could have as much influence as it does, and other sexual applications as well. So then they argue that, well, we don't have any transitional species. I say, well, yes, we do. We've got hundreds of them. And I try to show some examples. If you understand taxonomy, you'll get it. But people will always say, well, this is a new species of fruit fly or something like that, and it's still a fly, not having any concept of taxonomy. Well, then they said, we don't have any, what happened to the missing link? How come you never found that? We did, and 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 we did. We've got a dozen or so pre-human or quasi-human, depending on how you define it, hominines. Everything that they're asking for, we have produced, including one of my favorite creationist arguments, there's never been any such thing as a half a wing. Yes, there is. And this is magnificent. Mind you, I hope I'm not crashing anything. This is an oviraptor. And what's beautiful about this is that we don't have feathers for this animal, but we know that it had them. And there's this ongoing argument. Why people argue this, I can't imagine, whether dinosaurs were warm-blooded or not. This animal is sitting on a clutch of eggs, and he didn't steal them because we've taken these eggs and we know that these are oviraptor's eggs. Why are the arms draped over it like that? The animal's body is not big enough, doesn't contain the fat necessary to cover these things up. There's only one way to insulate those eggs, and that's with short half wings. Exactly the way chickens do, because chickens have half wings. Now, this is from a velociraptor, and I'm just crashing this mic all over the place, shouldn't move around a lot. But up here we have a detail of the two bones up the top. These are the velociraptor, and you can see the 6 regular intervals where you have quill spears. You can tell where the feathers were anchored in the living velociraptor. Completely screws up your impression of Jurassic Park, doesn't it? As compared to a turkey vulture where you have the same kind of structure. It's just a little bit more advanced because the turkey vulture actually flies, the velociraptor didn't. And so Jurassic Park probably wouldn't have looked as terrifying if they'd been more accurate with their renderings. Isn't that hilarious? So they say, okay, well, you've never had any vestigial structures, no vestigial limbs. Well, yeah, we did. This is my own beloved bird. His name is Dromy. I had him for 3 years, and my neighbors complained a lot, and I had to turn him over to a petting zoo. But this, as you can see, is this is not a wing. This is an arm, okay? And down here, I don't know if you can see it, but this is a claw, a single finger ending in a claw. And what's fascinating about this is there's no muscles controlling that arm. He cannot move them except in the expansion of his ribs and breathing, and that's it. Now, a vestigial limb does not necessarily mean that it is useless. It can mean that the original function is diminished. It can mean that it's adopted an entirely new function. But vestigial means that you have to start with what you had and adapt it accordingly, or it will trail away in disuse, and that's what happened here. This is equivalent to a Tyrannosaur's arm, except that a Tyrannosaur, I think, could actually do something with his arm. Dromy was utterly useless with his, so what's the point of the claw? No possible use in defense. So, everything that the creationists asked for, we produced, if it was something that evolution actually needed. So, creationists argue that evolution is just a theory, it's not a fact. These are the facts. of evolution. These are things that we can demonstrate are definitely true. These are things we don't just believe. These are things that are not just opinions. These are the things that we know and can show anybody that wants to challenge us. That evolution happens, we know that it happens. And it's not just micro, it is macro. We've demonstrated both. We know the processes, we know the mechanics of it, we know the natural selection, the sexual selection, and so on. We know that in classifications of taxonomy that birds are dinosaurs. They're not just descended from dinosaurs. They still are dinosaurs in the same way that you are still apes, you're still primates, you're still mammals. You don't ever grow out of your ancestry, and that's one of the great arguments that creationists like to use, but it's still a fly. Well, of course it is. But a fly is still an insect, and so is a praying mantis. So how are they related? Every animal on Earth has obvious relatives, whether extant or extinct, and this includes a lot of other non-animal life forms too. You can trace their lineage. Genetically, you can trace their lineage through the fossil record. We've got everything showing that what we believe is actually demonstrable. It's variable. It's real. We can show that what we believe is real. So what can the creationists show to present that there is a there? What is it how does creationism fail? Here are the facts in support of creationism. There you go. I'm not kidding, that's it. I welcome anyone to come forth and present to me something that they actually know. That they can show that what they believe is really true, and that it is concordant and indicative of miraculous, supernatural, divine creation as opposed to biological evolution. The best you will ever get is something like, say, this. And of course, these only ever show up as man-made frauds. And living in Texas, we have a few of these. We have a guy named Dr. Carl Baugh. I'm not sure what mail order catalog he got his doctorate from, but we know it didn't come from an actual degree. He's been implicated in a number of homemade Bigfoot kind of things for false footprints in Glen Rose, Texas, and that sort of thing. So we get a lot of those sorts of things. And we're never going to get any actual evidence for creationism, I don't think, until about this date. So what does creationism as a theory? It doesn't qualify as a theory at all. Intelligent design calls itself a theory, but does it count as one? When you compare the ideas of creationism, one, they want to say they teach creationism. First of all, you can't teach something if you don't know it. If there's no properties, nothing you can show, nothing that you can experiment with, there's anything anybody wants to believe, they can project and promote and just say, I believe that, and then it's done. And you can call it a fact because it's your own authority, or as some presuppositionalists have told me, God told me so it's real. God shows us in such a way that we know that it's true. That's the excuse. But the way it appears to me that creationism or intelligent design creationism compares to regular science is more like this. Imagine this is abiogenesis, Big Bang cosmology, and evolution together, and there's, obviously you can tell which one is intelligent design. I love this picture. So, somebody was talking about how pasty white they felt. Imagine how this guy feels. Because here's the big problem. The problem with creationism, the worst failure of creationism is simply that it doesn't work. Not just that it can't compete and that it needs to be fleshed out a bit, it just doesn't work. So in creationism, we have a host of claims which can't be verified. We have no kind of science that we can use. There's no products. There's no experiments. It does not advance knowledge at all. And one of the challenges that I would offer to creationism is this. Can you name one time, one occasion in the history of science when assuming supernatural explanations has ever improved our understanding of anything? Because I would guarantee that it has not. Here's another example of where creationism fails. These are footprints from Therapsids. Now, Therapsids are animals that should not exist because they are both reptiles and mammals at the same time. something which creationism wouldn't normally permit. But another reason that this set of tracks shouldn't exist is because it's intermediate in the Grand Canyon, the entirety of which was supposed to be laid down in the same flood. How do you get all these different sedimentary layers? And then in the interim, in the middle, you get this level, where you have placidly walking little animals. And also it shouldn't exist. And then you have other sedimentary layers compiled on top of that. And the website I got this from shows a whole collection of different types of fossils that should not exist in that kind of a formation in flood geology. And it isn't just flood geology that fails. It isn't just biology and Barrowmans where creationism fails. It also fails in cosmology. This is the model of the universe as presented by creationism, or at least it was in the time of the Bible. Now, of course, they're trying to change that. They're trying to say, well, it doesn't really mean that. It means this, or I have no idea what the excuse is that they came up with for the firmament. What I like about the firmament is that it doesn't just show up in the Bible. It shows up in a lot of other works too, like in China. There was a great flood myth in China where this Chinese warrior, having lost a battle, climbs up to a mountain and throws a temper tantrum, in which he accidentally punches a hole in the firmament with his spear, thus letting in all the water above the firmament. See, the ancient people thought we apparently lived in a snow globe. And that when all the water came in, the Naga goddess Nukwa had to come and mop it all up and save all of humanity. Now, the biggest failure, I think, of creationism, as we mentioned before, was, and then my wife doesn't like me to sit here and call them dishonest, but I don't know how else to say this. When you announce in advance that you will only accept evidence that supports your position, is that honest or is that dishonest? Okay. If you say in advance that you will never admit when you're wrong, is that dishonest? Okay. These are from leading creationist organizations. All creationist organizations have a statement of faith. I call these doctrinal obligations. If you read these carefully, they are announcing they will not consider any evidence that contradicts their a priori original position, their preconceived notions, their predetermined conclusions. They refuse to accept or permit or entertain the idea that they could even be wrong. This is as dishonest, I think, as it is possible to be, and that's why this is immediately recognized as the face of religion. Ignorance, I think, is not just what you don't know. Ignorance is what you won't know. It is what you ignore. And in order to hold many religious ideals, and when I'm talking about religious people, when I'm talking about creationists, I want you people to understand that I'm not talking about the young Teresa McBains and the young Jerry DeWitts. I'm talking about the people that are invested in this. I'm talking about Ken Ham and Kent Hovind and Eric Hovind and all the people that are making all this money, leading people astray and lying to them on purpose. This refusal to accept reality and instead adopting a fantasy reminds me of something else. What is the other context? Oh yes, this. And this is the best way that I think I can put this. These people want to have the wool pulled over their eyes. They don't want to see how deep the rabbit hole goes. I would rather know an uncomfortable truth than to believe a beautiful lie. And a better way to put it, perhaps, is that it strikes me that we have a division where some people prefer or have a need to believe, and the rest of us, and I trust everyone here, would rather have a desire to understand. And so we look at reality more this way. We understand that science works by gathering data, and even if we don't have the whole picture, we know that all the data that we can show is actually correct will lead us into one ultimate conclusion, whereas the alternative seems to be like you get a handful of different people representing different religions or changing their minds constantly, so the room is always filling with more and more people, each with the absolute truth. They all have a dart in their hand, and they all throw it blindfolded at a board, hopefully. But wherever the dart lands, that's the absolute truth, and they're going to stick with that until the next guy comes in and throws his dart. And that's why religions seem to shard off in every possible direction, because they have no substance whatsoever to them. And this is particularly true in religious extremism like creationism. And here again to remind you of our philosophy and how we avoid this, how we avoid the biases, and how we seek truth instead, because I was criticized for not loving truth. This sentiment. Whatever is inconsistent with the facts, no matter how fond of it we are, must be discarded or revised. The complete antithesis to the faith statement of all creationist organizations. And I will allow those creationist organizations the last word in my discussion here. Thank you.